The moment began like any other political panel, tense but controlled, with an undertone of theatrics that had become customary in primetime media. The network had billed the event as a conversation on national security, but it was clear from the beginning that sparks would fly. Seated across from each other were Karoline Leavitt, the rising firebrand of the right known for her provocative commentary, and Kash Patel, the former Trump administration official with deep roots in intelligence and law. From the outset, Karoline leaned into her usual playbook, brash, unapologetic, calculated. She painted a bleak picture of America under current leadership, hammering points about immigration, terrorism, and foreign interference. Kash, by contrast, was calm but firm, correcting her exaggerations with facts and counterpoints delivered with surgical precision. The first 15 minutes were fiery, but civil. The real moment, the one that would dominate the nation's headlines and social feeds for weeks, came as Kash calmly debunked one of Karoline's claims regarding foreign aid policy. He cited his experience in the Defense Department and quietly corrected her numbers. Karoline paused, smirked, and said with a forced laugh, "Maybe you'd understand better if you went back to India." The studio went silent. Cameras kept rolling. There was no mistaking it. No playful sarcasm, no veiled joke. Just 6 loaded words spoken with a smile that curdled on her own lips as the weight of what she had said began to register. The silence in the studio was immediate and deafening. Even the host, a normally unflappable media veteran, blinked in stunned disbelief. Kash Patel sat completely still, the comment hanging between them like a lit fuse. A few gasps echoed from the crew behind the cameras. Karoline's eyes darted slightly, as if realizing too late that the line had not landed the way she expected. She shifted in her seat, attempting to follow up, perhaps backtrack, but the damage was done. Kash didn't interrupt. He didn't raise his voice. He simply waited, letting the moment breathe in its full discomfort. Then, after a long pause, he leaned forward, eyes steady and unflinching, and said, "That's the difference between you and me, Karoline. I fought for this country. I served in the military. I stood in the Situation Room while you were still Googling how a bill becomes law. And yet you still think you can question where I belong." The host looked down, visibly shaken. "No one dared speak." Kash's voice didn't waver. "My parents came here legally. They built a life from nothing. They worked 16-hour days so their son could grow up believing that if he worked hard enough, this country would treat him like an American, not an immigrant, not an outsider. But tonight, on national television, you proved that for some people, no amount of service, no amount of sacrifice is ever enough." The audience in the live studio remained frozen. Karoline sat stiff, her face locked in a forced expression of neutrality, but her hands betrayed her. They twitched subtly on the table, fingers flexing as if grasping for control. Kash continued, his voice measured but blistering. "You don't know what patriotism is. You think waving a flag and yelling into a microphone makes you brave? But real courage is staying in the room when someone tries to humiliate you. It's answering hate with truth." The host tried to intervene with a diplomatic interjection, but even he seemed to recognize that no interruption would soften the blow. Karoline opened her mouth to respond, but Kash calmly raised his hand. "You've said enough," he added. "And now, the country can decide what to do with that." The show returned from commercial in a daze, the host attempting to regain footing with neutral commentary, but the mood had irrevocably changed. Karoline's energy was gone, replaced by a cautious silence, her usual confidence drained by the gravity of what she had unleashed. Kash remained poised, answering further questions with his trademark restraint, avoiding further reference to the moment that had already exploded beyond the confines of the studio. Within minutes of airing, the clip hit the internet, and by morning, it was everywhere. News anchors on both sides of the aisle couldn't avoid it. Conservative outlets struggled to frame the event without implicating their rising star. Some tried to spin it as a misunderstanding, while others ignored it entirely. But independents and mainstream voices weren't so forgiving. "A racial dog whistle live on air," one headline read. "Karoline Leavitt tells war veteran to go back to India," declared another. Meanwhile, Kash Patel remained largely quiet in the days that followed. He issued no formal statements, granted no follow-up interviews. He didn't need to. The footage spoke louder than any rebuttal. The public saw everything, her words, his silence, and then his precise, devastating reply. Social media lit up with fury and admiration in equal measure. Hashtags like hashtag GoBackGate, hashtag Kash stands tall, and hashtag We Are All American began trending across Twitter and TikTok. Veterans groups, immigrant advocacy organizations, and civil rights leaders rushed to support Patel, some organizing rallies and others calling for Karoline Leavitt to be formally reprimanded or barred from future debates. A petition demanding her removal from her current political post amassed over 250,000 signatures within 48 hours. Late-night hosts weighed in, some with satire, others with genuine disbelief. "You know you've said something truly vile," said one prominent comedian, "when you manage to insult a war hero, an immigrant, and your entire generation in a single sentence." Meanwhile, young Indian Americans began sharing their own stories under the hashtag Kash spoke for me, recounting years of being told to go back to a place many had never even been. Kash Patel, without lifting a finger, had become a symbol not of victimhood, but of stoic, righteous resistance to ignorance. He hadn't argued, he hadn't shouted. He had simply stood his ground, and in doing so, exposed something deeper in the country's political discourse. A line had been crossed. And no one left, right, or center could pretend they hadn't seen it. As the story continued to gain momentum, political figures across the spectrum were compelled to respond. Former President Barack Obama posted a rare public statement without naming names, writing, "We still have a long way to go when Americans who look different, speak differently, or worship differently are still told to leave the country they've served." Nikki Haley, the former UN ambassador of Indian descent, took a bolder route, tweeting directly, "Kash Patel is an American, period. He served his country. He deserves respect, not insults wrapped in bigotry." Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt's team scrambled for a response. At first, she remained silent, possibly hoping the storm would pass. But as sponsors of her affiliated platforms began quietly withdrawing support and scheduled appearances were abruptly canceled, the pressure to say something became impossible to ignore. 3 days later, she appeared on a conservative podcast, offering what many described as a half-hearted explanation. "It was a joke," she said. "People are so sensitive now. I was just saying he doesn't seem to love America the way I do." The backlash to that interview was even harsher. Commentators noted that rather than apologize, she doubled down. Editorials condemned her not just for the original insult, but for the arrogance of refusing to own it. The fire she had sparked now turned inward, consuming her credibility piece by piece. Kash Patel, meanwhile, maintained an unshakable calm. He turned down interview after interview, resisting the urge to weaponize the moment for personal or political gain. Instead, he issued a brief written statement through his office. "My love for this country is not contingent on anyone else's acceptance. I served because I believe in America's ideals even when we fall short. I will not be deterred by ignorance, and I will not engage in performative outrage." That statement, simple and elegant, only deepened the nation's respect. For once, Americans saw a political figure refuse to capitalize on victimhood. He didn't cry foul. He didn't claim martyrdom. He simply stood tall, and that restraint carried more power than 100 fiery retorts. College campuses invited him to speak. Military organizations honored him at private luncheons. And quietly, behind the scenes, several high-level political operatives began discussing whether Kash Patel, already experienced, respected, and now nationally visible, was ripe for a Senate run. He had something few others possessed, authenticity forged in fire. And unlike his opponent, he hadn't needed a spotlight to expose the truth. The truth had revealed itself, and the country had listened. Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt faced a reckoning of her own making. Her political alliances began to fracture. A prominent think tank she had partnered with quietly removed her from its speaking tour. A major conservative news outlet canceled a scheduled segment, citing unforeseen production changes. Behind the scenes, sources confirmed the real reason: advertisers were pulling out. Constituents who had once championed her as a rising star were suddenly silent, unwilling to defend the indefensible. A local town hall in New Hampshire turned hostile when voters asked her point-blank, "Do you actually believe people who weren't born here shouldn't be considered American?" She stammered through a vague answer, but the damage was irreversible. In the world of politics, perception is survival. And Karoline's perception was now